Pour the wine. Don't think. The words didn't rise above a calm tone, but they landed like a quiet command that no one in the room would dare question. Crystal glasses caught the amber light of a private penthouse high above downtown Manhattan, the skyline stretching like a promise of power beneath floor-to-ceiling windows. Conversations hummed low and confident, the kind of voices that moved markets without ever needing to shout. At the center of it all sat Omar al-Hakim, a billionaire sheikh whose presence alone seemed to tilt the room in his favor, tailored suit, measured breath, eyes that rarely lingered on anything he considered beneath him. Naomi Carter stood just behind his shoulder, a black waitress in a pressed uniform, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, moving with the kind of precision that made her nearly invisible, the way people like him preferred it. She poured the wine exactly as instructed, steady hand, no hesitation, even as her ears caught every word being spoken around the table, words wrapped in a language most assumed she would never understand. Arabic flowed between the men like a private currency, fast, confident, threaded with numbers and quiet laughter, and Naomi heard it all, every subtle shift in tone, every pause that meant more than the words themselves, but her face gave nothing away, not a flicker, not a hint, because invisibility, she had learned, was not weakness, it was cover. One of the investors leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass, his voice dipping just enough to suggest secrecy, yet loud enough to be heard by those who mattered. Once he signs, the transfer clears in 48 hours, he said in Arabic, a smirk barely hidden. Another man chuckled softly. He won't question it. He never does. Omar's expression remained composed, confident in the deal unfolding before him, a $200 million agreement that promised expansion, influence, control, everything a man like him measured success by. Naomi moved to the next glass, pouring with the same calm rhythm, though inside, something shifted, a quiet calculation forming, because what they were saying, what they believed was hidden, wasn't just careless, it was deliberate. The room felt warmer now, thicker, as if the air itself carried the weight of something about to break. One of the men glanced briefly in her direction, dismissive, barely a second of attention before returning to the conversation. Relax, he added with a smirk, still in Arabic. She doesn't even understand English half the time. A few quiet laughs followed, low and confident, the kind of laughter that came from certainty, from believing no one outside their circle could touch them. Naomi set the bottle down gently, the soft click of glass against polished wood almost too quiet to notice, but it marked a shift, a moment suspended between what was expected and what was about to happen. Her eyes lifted, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to take in the room, the men, the contract resting near Omar's hand, pages filled with numbers that looked flawless to anyone who wasn't listening closely enough. The skyline beyond the glass shimmered, lights flickering like distant signals, and for a second, everything slowed, the voices, the movement, even the steady rhythm of breath in the room. Naomi inhaled once, controlled, measured, the same way she had learned to steady herself long before nights like this, long before rooms like this decided who mattered and who didn't. Then, without raising her voice, without changing her posture, she spoke. This is fake. The words cut clean through the room, not loud, not forced, but precise enough to stop every conversation mid-breath. Glasses paused halfway to lips, eyes shifted, and for the first time that night, Omar al-Hakim looked directly at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, as if seeing something that hadn't been there a moment ago. And Naomi, still standing in her uniform, still holding nothing but quiet composure, met the gaze without flinching, because for the first time in that room, she was no longer invisible. No one spoke for 3 full seconds, and in a room where silence usually meant control, this kind of silence felt different, heavier, like something had slipped out of place and no one knew how to put it back. Omar al-Hakim did not raise his voice, did not shift in his seat, but his eyes stayed locked on Naomi with a precision that suggested calculation, not confusion, as if he were deciding whether what he had just heard was an interruption or a threat. Around the table, the men who had been speaking so confidently moments ago now exchanged brief glances, the kind that carried more meaning than words, their posture tightening just enough to betray that something had changed. Naomi did not move, did not step back, did not apologize, and that alone broke an unspoken rule of rooms like this, because people in her position were expected to correct themselves, to shrink, to disappear again. Instead, she reached for the contract resting near Omar's hand and turned it slightly, her fingers steady, her voice calm, and when she spoke again, it was no longer in English. The shift was immediate, unmistakable, her Arabic precise, fluid, carrying the weight of someone who did not just understand the language but lived inside its structure. Clause 12, she said, her tone even. The transfer conditions contradict the escrow timeline stated on page 4. One of the investors leaned forward, his expression tightening, attempting a quick dismissal. That is standard formatting, he replied in Arabic, a little too quickly, a little too controlled. Naomi did not look at him. She kept her focus on the document, tracing a line of text with the tip of her finger. It is not formatting, she continued, still calm, still measured. It is a delay trigger. It reroutes the funds through a secondary holding account that is not disclosed anywhere else in the agreement. The words landed differently this time, not as an interruption, but as a fracture, small but spreading. Omar's hand, which had been resting loosely on the table, shifted slightly closer to the contract, his gaze flickering downward for the first time since she spoke. Across from him, one of the men let out a quiet breath, the kind that sounded almost like a laugh but carried none of the ease from before. "You are misunderstanding," he said, his voice tighter now, his confidence thinning at the edges. Naomi finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly, and there was no challenge in her expression, no anger, just certainty. "Then explain why the routing code references a shell entity registered less than 3 months ago," she said, still in Arabic, her pronunciation clean, deliberate. The room shifted again, more noticeably this time, chairs adjusting slightly, shoulders straightening, the easy rhythm of the evening replaced by something sharper, more exposed. Omar picked up the contract, flipping through the pages with controlled movements, his eyes scanning, slower than before, more careful, and the silence that followed was no longer confusion, it was recognition. Naomi stepped back half an inch, not retreating, just giving space, her role unchanged on the surface, still the waitress in the room, still the one who poured the wine, but now every person at that table was aware of her in a way they had not been seconds ago. One of the investors reached for his glass, then stopped midway, setting it back down untouched, as if even that small motion felt uncertain now. Omar's voice, when it came, was quiet but unmistakably different. "Read it again," he said, not to Naomi, but to the man who had spoken earlier, his tone stripped of the casual authority it held before, replaced with something colder, more exacting. And for the first time that night, the men who had built their confidence on being the smartest in the room were no longer speaking over her, they were trying to keep up. The man across the table cleared his throat and reached for the contract again, but this time his hands were not as steady, his fingers pausing for just a fraction longer before turning each page as if the paper itself had become heavier. He began to read aloud in Arabic, slower now, careful, his earlier confidence replaced by a deliberate precision that felt forced, like someone trying to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped. "The funds will be transferred through a secured intermediary account," he said, his voice measured, but the words did not carry the same certainty they had minutes ago. Omar did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the document, his posture still, yet there was a shift in the air around him, a tightening, as though every detail now mattered in a way it had not before. Naomi remained where she stood, neither stepping forward nor retreating, her presence quiet but undeniable, the kind that did not demand attention yet held it completely. One of the other investors leaned in, attempting to reframe the moment, his tone light, almost dismissive. "These structures are common in international deals," he said, switching to English now, perhaps hoping to move the conversation back into familiar territory. "It is simply a layer of protection." Naomi's eyes moved toward him briefly, not confrontational, just aware, and then back to the contract. "Protection for whom?" she asked, her voice steady, her words landing with a clarity that cut through the attempt to soften the situation. The question lingered, unanswered, because no one at the table could respond without revealing more than they intended. Omar finally lifted his head, his gaze moving from the page to the men seated around him, one by one, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate, as if recalibrating every assumption he had made since walking into the room. "Translate that clause again," he said quietly, this time directing the request toward Naomi. It was a subtle shift, but everyone felt it, the authority in the room no longer flowing in one direction. Naomi stepped closer to the table, just enough to see the text clearly, and began to speak in Arabic once more, her tone even, each word articulated with calm precision. "The account listed here is not a holding account," she explained. "It is a pass-through entity. Funds do not remain there. They move immediately to a secondary destination that is not disclosed in this agreement." As she spoke, the skyline beyond the glass seemed distant, irrelevant, the entire room narrowing to the space around that table and the truth unfolding within it. One of the men shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking briefly toward the exit before returning to Omar, as if measuring how much longer he could maintain the illusion. "That is an interpretation," he said, but the words lacked conviction, falling flat against the growing weight of what Naomi had revealed. Omar closed the contract slowly, his fingers resting on the cover for a moment longer than necessary, his expression unreadable, yet no longer indifferent. "And the entity," he asked, his voice low, controlled, "who owns it?" Naomi did not hesitate. "A private registration in Delaware," she replied, switching back to English, her tone unchanged. "No listed beneficiaries. But the routing code connects to a financial group that has been flagged in 3 separate investigations over the past 18 months. The room did not react immediately, but the silence that followed was different from before, no longer uncertainty, no longer surprise, but something closer to realization, the kind that arrives quietly and settles deeply. Omar leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to the men across from him, and for the first time that night, it was not the gaze of a man about to sign a deal, it was the gaze of someone who had just seen through it. And Naomi, standing just behind him, remained exactly where she had been all along, the one person in the room who had never been confused about what was really happening. No one reached for their glass now, not even out of habit, because something far more valuable than the deal itself was hanging in the air, something harder to recover once lost, and everyone in that room knew it. Omar al-Hakim did not raise his voice or show anger, but the absence of reaction from a man like him carried more weight than any outburst ever could. He placed the contract flat on the table, aligning its edges with slow precision, as if restoring order to something that had already revealed its flaws, then looked up again, his gaze steady, no longer searching, but confirming. "You said 3 investigations," he said, his voice calm, but sharpened by intent, directing the question toward Naomi without hesitation this time. It was no longer unusual for her to be addressed. It was expected. Naomi nodded slightly, her posture unchanged, her tone even as she responded. "Yes, sir. 2 involving cross-border wire discrepancies and 1 tied to asset concealment through layered entities. All 3 cases involved the same routing structure that appears in this document." The words did not rush, did not dramatize, they simply existed, and that made them harder to challenge. One of the men across the table shifted in his chair, leaning forward with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, attempting to reclaim control with tone instead of substance. "With respect," he said carefully, "you are drawing connections that are not formally established. These are complex financial instruments. Misinterpretation is easy, especially without full context." Naomi did not interrupt him, did not react, and that silence, that restraint, forced him to finish without resistance, leaving his words hanging in a space that no longer protected them. Omar's eyes moved briefly toward the speaker, then back to Naomi. "And do you have context?" he asked, his voice still measured, but now carrying a different kind of focus, one that demanded clarity, not opinion. Naomi inhaled once, steady, controlled, as if choosing her words not for impact, but for accuracy. "I worked as a junior analyst for a compliance firm in Washington, District of Columbia, for 18 months, she said. My focus was transaction mapping and risk flags in international transfers. The structure in this agreement follows a pattern that is designed to appear compliant on the surface while redirecting funds through untraceable paths once the initial authorization is complete." The room absorbed that information slowly, like a tide pulling back before anyone noticed the shoreline had changed. One of the investors let out a short breath, then leaned back, crossing his arms, a gesture meant to signal confidence but arriving just a moment too late. "Even if that were true," he said, his voice tightening slightly, "you are still making assumptions based on partial data. This deal has been reviewed by legal teams on both sides. Omar's expression did not change, but his attention did, shifting away from the man entirely as if the argument no longer held value. He reached for the contract again, flipping to the page Naomi had referenced, his finger tracing the line she had indicated earlier, slower now, more deliberate, as if reading it for the first time without the filter of expectation. The city lights beyond the glass continued to glow, but inside the room, the energy had shifted completely, no longer driven by anticipation, but by scrutiny. Naomi remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence grounded, not elevated, not defensive, simply certain. Another man at the table glanced toward the door, then back at Omar, his voice softer this time. "We can clarify any concerns," he offered. "There is no need to rush conclusions." Omar closed the contract again, this time with finality, the sound quiet but decisive, and rested his hand on top of it as if placing a boundary between what had been presented and what would be accepted. "There will be no conclusions tonight," he said calmly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. His gaze lifted once more, sweeping across the table, then stopping briefly on Naomi, not as an afterthought, but as a point of reference. In that moment, the balance of the room settled into a new shape, one where the loudest voices no longer carried the most authority, and the person who had entered unnoticed now stood at the center of every decision that would follow. The decision did not echo, but it settled over the room like a line no one was willing to cross. One of the investors forced a small, controlled smile, the kind used when a situation begins slipping beyond recovery but pride refuses to acknowledge it. "Of course," he said, nodding slightly, his tone measured, "we can revisit the structure and provide full transparency. There is no need to pause momentum over a misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding lingered, carefully chosen, almost rehearsed, but it no longer carried weight. Omar al-Hakim did not respond to it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his posture composed, his silence deliberate, allowing the absence of agreement to speak more clearly than any rejection. His eyes shifted once more to Naomi, studying her now with a different lens, not as part of the environment, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and that alone changed the dynamic of everything that followed. "If the funds move as you described," he said slowly, his voice calm, "how long before they disappear beyond recovery?" Naomi did not hesitate. "Less than 12 hours, she replied, her tone steady. "Once the second transfer is executed, the trail fragments across multiple jurisdictions. At that point, recovery becomes unlikely without immediate intervention." A faint tension passed through the room, subtle but undeniable, like a current running beneath the surface. One of the men adjusted his cufflinks, another reached for his glass again but stopped halfway, setting it down without taking a sip, each small movement revealing more than any argument could. "That is a hypothetical scenario," the first investor replied, though his voice no longer carried the same conviction, each word placed carefully, as if avoiding something he could no longer fully control. Naomi's gaze remained calm, not challenging, not emotional, just clear. "It is a predictable one," she said quietly. "The structure is designed for speed, not oversight." The skyline outside continued to shimmer, the city alive and unaware, but inside that room, time seemed to move differently, stretched between what had been assumed and what was now undeniable. Omar rested his fingers lightly against the edge of the table, tapping once, not impatiently, but thoughtfully, as if recalculating a decision that had already been made in his mind hours earlier. "You said you worked in compliance," he said, his voice returning to its steady rhythm. "Why are you here?" The question was not dismissive. It was direct, precise, and for the first time, it carried something close to curiosity. Naomi held his gaze, unshaken. "Because access does not always come from titles," she answered. "Sometimes it comes from proximity." The answer was simple, but it carried layers, the kind that did not need explanation to be understood. Around the table, no one interrupted, no one attempted to redirect, because the conversation had shifted beyond them. Omar studied her for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, not dramatic, not performative, just acknowledgement. He turned his attention back to the men across from him, and when he spoke again, his tone was unchanged, but its meaning was absolute. "This agreement will be reviewed independently, he said. Until then, no funds move. There was no resistance this time, no immediate pushback, only a quiet acceptance settling in, the realization that whatever control they believed they held had already dissolved. One of the men exhaled slowly, another leaned back in his chair, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something closer to calculation. Naomi stepped back half a step, returning to her original position, her role unchanged in appearance, but entirely transformed in reality. The bottle of wine still rested where she had placed it, untouched, the glasses still half full, but no one reached for them now, because the room had shifted from celebration to awareness, from certainty to scrutiny. And in that shift, the person they had dismissed without a second thought had become the one detail they could no longer ignore. No one tried to restart the conversation after that, not in the way they had before, with polished confidence and rehearsed certainty, because the room no longer belonged to the version of events they had prepared for. The energy had shifted into something quieter, sharper, a space where every word now carried consequence. One of the investors reached for a leather portfolio beside him, opening it slowly as if searching for something that could restore direction, but even that motion felt uncertain, like a gesture out of place in a moment that had already moved beyond control. Omar al-Hakim remained still, his gaze lowered briefly toward the contract, then lifting again with a clarity that suggested he had already moved past the document itself and into something deeper, something about judgment, about trust, about the unseen variables that define decisions far more than numbers ever could. Who introduced this structure? He asked, his voice calm, but now edged with something unmistakable, not anger, but accountability. The question landed without force, yet no one answered immediately, and that hesitation spoke louder than any explanation could. The man who had led most of the discussion earlier shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture, attempting to meet Omar's gaze with the same authority he had carried at the beginning of the evening, but something in his expression had changed, something less certain, less controlled. "It came through our advisory network," he said carefully, choosing each word as if stepping across fragile ground. "A trusted channel we have used before." Omar's eyes did not move from him. "Name," he said, a single word, precise and unyielding. The room tightened again, the silence returning, but this time it was not unfamiliar, it was expected, almost inevitable. Naomi stood where she had been, her presence unchanged, but her awareness fully engaged, listening not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. The man hesitated, then spoke a name, one that did not carry weight in the room until Naomi's expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough to signal recognition. Omar noticed. His gaze flickered toward her, brief but intentional. "You know it," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. Naomi nodded once. "It appears in 2 of the flagged cases," she replied. Always positioned as an intermediary, never directly accountable. The word settled into the space between them, connecting pieces that had been presented as separate, revealing a pattern that was no longer abstract. One of the other men leaned forward, his tone more urgent now, though still restrained. "We can verify that immediately," he said. "There may be a misunderstanding in how the entity is being categorized." Naomi did not respond to him. She did not need to. The room had already moved past the need for reassurance. Omar leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled for a moment before resting again on the table, his expression composed, but now fully engaged, every detail under consideration. "Send me the full chain of introductions," he said. "Every contact, every step." There was no resistance, only a quiet acknowledgement, because the authority to question had shifted, and everyone felt it. The man nodded, reaching for his phone, his movements controlled but lacking the ease they once had. Naomi stepped subtly to the side, allowing space, her role once again blending into the background in form, but not in impact. The city outside continued its rhythm, distant traffic, scattered lights, a world untouched by what had just unfolded, but inside that room, nothing remained as it had been. Omar's gaze returned to her once more, not with surprise now, but with recognition, the kind that comes when someone recalculates not just a situation, but a person. "You saw this before anyone else," he said quietly. Naomi met his eyes, her voice steady. "I listened before anyone else did." The difference was subtle, but it carried weight, the distinction between hearing and understanding, between presence and awareness. Omar gave a slight nod, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to acknowledge the truth in her words. Around them, the others continued their quiet attempts to recover structure, to gather information, to rebuild something that could hold, but the foundation had already shifted. And in that shift, the one person who had entered the room unseen had become the one no one could afford to overlook again. The name hung in the air longer than expected, not because it was unfamiliar, but because of what it implied when placed alongside everything else Naomi had revealed. The man who had spoken it shifted again, this time more noticeably, his confidence no longer masking the subtle urgency beneath his composure. His phone was already in his hand now, screen lit, fingers moving quickly as if speed alone could restore control over a situation that had already unraveled. Across the table, another investor leaned in, lowering his voice as he spoke, not out of respect, but out of instinct, as though the room itself had become something that required caution. "We can confirm the chain within minutes," he said, glancing toward Omar, his tone careful, almost deferential now. "If there is any irregularity, we will isolate it immediately." Omar did not acknowledge the reassurance. His attention had moved beyond promises and into verification, beyond statements and into patterns, and that shift made every attempt to manage perception feel unnecessary. He watched as the man scrolled through his contacts, as messages were sent, as quiet instructions were issued with controlled urgency, and he said nothing, because silence, in that moment, demanded more truth than conversation ever could. Naomi remained where she stood, her presence grounded, her eyes observing not just the actions, but the timing, the sequence, the subtle delays between responses, because those details mattered more than any spoken defense. The room no longer felt like a place where a deal was being finalized. It felt like a place where something hidden was being uncovered layer by layer, without force, without confrontation, just through clarity. A message notification appeared on the man's screen, and for a brief second, his expression shifted, a flicker of something unguarded, something closer to concern than control, before it disappeared behind a practiced neutrality. He read it quickly, then again more slowly, as if hoping the words would change the second time. They did not. "It is being reviewed," he said, lifting his head, his voice steady but lacking the ease it once carried. "There appears to be a discrepancy in the registration timeline." The phrasing was careful, restrained, but it confirmed what Naomi had already made clear. Omar's gaze did not move. "Explain," he said, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that required more than surface answers. The man hesitated, just long enough to reveal that whatever he had been told was not simple. The entity was established recently, he admitted, and its prior associations are not fully documented in the initial brief. Naomi did not react, but her stillness now carried a different weight, because what had been presented as uncertainty was becoming confirmation. Another message came through, then another, each one adding pressure to the silence rather than relieving it. The man's posture shifted again, his shoulders tightening slightly as he processed information faster than he could comfortably present it. "There are additional flags," he added, his voice quieter now. "Connections to accounts that were previously closed under investigation." The words did not echo, but they settled heavily, each one reinforcing the pattern Naomi had described with calm precision minutes earlier. Across the table, the others no longer attempted to speak over the situation, no longer tried to reframe it, because the structure they had relied on was no longer holding. Omar leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his gaze steady, his expression controlled, but no longer neutral. "And you were not aware of this," he said, not as a question, but as a measured observation directed at the group as a whole. No one answered immediately, because any answer would carry implication, and implication, in that moment, was more dangerous than silence. Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward the contract again, then back to Omar, not to intervene, not to assert, but simply present, because the truth did not need reinforcement anymore, it was unfolding on its own. The man lowered his phone slowly, the screen dimming as if the information it held had already done its work. "We were not given full visibility," he said finally, the admission controlled but unavoidable. Omar held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small, decisive motion that carried finality without force. the room did not react outwardly, but something within it shifted permanently, the understanding that what had been presented as opportunity was now exposed as risk, and that exposure had not come from analysts, advisors, or executives, but from the one person no one had thought to listen to. And as the city lights continued to flicker beyond the glass, indifferent to what had just changed, every person in that room understood something they had not understood when the night began: that power is not always held by the one who speaks the most, but by the one who sees what others choose to ignore. The air in the room no longer carried negotiation, it carried consequence, and that difference settled into every corner with quiet precision. No one reached for their phones now without purpose, no one spoke unless necessary, because the illusion of control had been replaced by the need for clarity. Omar al-Hakim remained still for a moment longer, then slowly lifted the contract once again, not to review it, but to close it fully, pressing the cover flat against the table with a finality that did not require explanation. Across from him, the men who had arrived with confidence now sat with measured restraint, their posture adjusted, their tone recalibrated, each one aware that the narrative they had built no longer held. "This ends here," Omar said, his voice calm, not raised, but carrying a weight that settled instantly, removing any remaining ambiguity from the room. No one challenged him. No one tried to redirect. The deal, once framed as inevitable, had dissolved without negotiation, without argument, simply because the truth had been seen. One of the investors nodded slowly, his expression controlled, though the tension in his jaw betrayed what his words would not. "We understand," he said, his tone neutral, but lacking the certainty that had filled the room earlier. "We will cooperate fully with any follow-up." Omar did not respond to the statement directly. His attention had already moved beyond them, beyond the failed agreement, beyond the structure that had just been exposed. Instead, his gaze shifted once more to Naomi, steady, focused, no longer evaluating her as a factor in the room, but recognizing her as the turning point of it. "What would you have done?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not performative, not for the others, but directed solely at her, "if you had not been standing here tonight?" The question was simple, but it carried something deeper, something about choice, about timing, about the thin line between being unseen and being unheard. Naomi did not rush her answer. She held his gaze, her posture unchanged, her voice even. "The same thing," she said. "I would have spoken when it mattered." The room absorbed that quietly, not as a declaration, but as a fact, one that required no defense. Omar studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod, acknowledging not just the answer, but the certainty behind it. Around them, chairs shifted as the others began to gather their things, movements controlled, voices low, the evening no longer something to extend, but something to exit. The skyline outside remained unchanged, the city still alive with motion and light, but inside, the rhythm had completely reset. The glasses remained half full, untouched, the wine no longer part of the evening's purpose, just a detail left behind in a moment that had moved on. Naomi stepped back slightly, returning to the quiet position she had started in, her presence once again blending into the edges of the room in form, but not in meaning. Omar rose from his seat, his movements measured, composed, and for a brief second, the room seemed to pause with him, as if acknowledging that whatever had just happened would not be forgotten. He adjusted his jacket, then looked at Naomi one last time, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with clarity. "You saw what others did not," he said. Naomi's expression remained calm, her voice steady. "I listened when others chose not to." The distinction settled between them, simple, undeniable. Omar gave a final nod, then turned away, walking toward the exit with the same quiet authority he had entered with, but now carrying something different, something sharpened by what he had just witnessed. And as the doors closed behind him, the room was left not with the memory of a deal lost, but with the realization of how close it had come to being accepted, and how one voice, steady and precise, had changed the outcome of everything without ever needing to raise itself above a whisper. The door closed softly behind Omar al-Hakim, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to understand what had just happened. The skyline still shimmered beyond the glass, taxis moving like lines of light through the streets below, the city continuing forward without pause, unaware that inside this penthouse, a decision worth $200 million had just been undone by a voice no one had planned for. One by one, the men at the table gathered their things, their movements quieter now, more deliberate, the sharp edges of their earlier confidence softened into something more cautious, more reflective. No one joked, no one filled the silence, because there was nothing left to perform. The contract remained where it had been placed, closed, untouched, no longer an opportunity, but a reminder. Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been before the room shifted, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture steady, her expression calm, as if nothing about her had changed, even though everything around her had. A server from the hallway stepped in briefly, glancing at the table, sensing the altered atmosphere without understanding it, then quietly stepped back out, leaving the room to settle on its own terms. One of the investors paused near the edge of the table, his eyes lingering on Naomi for a moment, not with recognition exactly, but with something close to it, as if trying to reconcile the person he had overlooked with the outcome he could not ignore. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then turned away without speaking, because there were no words that would restore what had already been lost. Naomi moved slowly, picking up the bottle of wine she had set down earlier, straightening the glasses, adjusting the table with the same precision she had shown at the beginning of the evening, her actions unchanged, her rhythm steady, but now every movement carried a different meaning. She was no longer invisible, even if no one said it out loud. The room gradually emptied, footsteps fading, voices disappearing into the hallway, until only the quiet hum of the city remained, filtering through the glass like distant static. Naomi paused for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the skyline, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance, each one representing a decision, a story, a moment where something could shift without warning. She did not smile, did not reflect outwardly, but there was a stillness in her that spoke of understanding, the kind that comes not from recognition, but from knowing exactly what had just taken place. A few minutes later, the door opened again, softer this time, and Omar stepped back into the room, alone. He did not rush, did not announce himself, simply walked in with the same measured presence, his gaze finding Naomi immediately as if the room no longer existed without her in it. For a second, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, but clear. Naomi Carter, he said finally, her name precise, remembered, not asked. She turned slightly toward him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone steady. Omar took a few steps closer, stopping at the edge of the table, the contract still resting between them, a silent witness to everything that had changed. "You prevented a loss that would not have been recovered," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that did not need emphasis. Naomi did not respond immediately, not out of uncertainty, but because acknowledgement was not why she had spoken. "I did what I understood," she said simply. Omar studied her for a moment, then nodded once, a gesture that carried more respect than any praise could. "Understanding is rare," he said. "Even in rooms built on intelligence." The word settled between them, not as a compliment, but as a truth. He glanced briefly at the skyline, then back at her, his expression composed, but changed in a way that did not need explanation. "If you ever choose not to remain unseen," he added, "there are places where that understanding would not be overlooked." Naomi held his gaze, her expression calm, her voice unchanged. "Sometimes being unseen is what allows you to see clearly," she replied. Omar paused, then gave a slight, knowing nod, as if recognizing something he could not argue with. He turned once more toward the door, stopping briefly before he left, his voice quiet but certain. "Then do not stop seeing." The door closed behind him again, and this time, the silence that followed was not empty, but complete. Naomi stood there for a moment longer, then returned to the table, finishing what she had started, adjusting what remained, restoring order not because it erased what had happened, but because it honored it in the only way she knew how. And somewhere between the untouched glasses and the closed contract, the room held onto one simple truth, that power does not always arrive announced, and the voice that changes everything is often the one no one thought to hear until it was too late to ignore.